This video contains discussions of child abuse. Viewer discretion advised.
Was the first to interview the parents who later admitted to chaining their children to their bed.
On January 14, 2018, a 17-year-old girl climbed out of a window she'd spent years planning to escape through. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial 911. What she told the dispatcher would uncover one of the most horrific child abuse cases in American history. 13 siblings, some shackled to beds, living in conditions police described as torture chambers. But here's what most people don't know. The rescue was just the beginning of their nightmare. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Jordan Turpin says being rescued was almost as traumatic as the abuse itself. Stay with me. It was just after 6 a.m. on January 14, 2018, when a teenage girl with matted hair and trembling hands approached a deactivated cell phone she'd secretly taken from the house. She'd been planning this moment for 2 years. 17-year-old Jordan Turpin had finally worked up the courage to climb out of her bedroom window, a window her parents had nailed shut years ago, but had recently loosened just enough for her to squeeze through. She dialed 911. "My parents are religious," she told the dispatcher, her voice shaking. "But it's also abuse, I think." The dispatcher asked her to describe what was happening inside the house at 160 Muir Woods Road in Perris, California. Jordan's words came out in fragments. She'd been so isolated, so starved of normal human interaction, that she struggled to explain what normal even meant. She mentioned chains, siblings who couldn't walk, years without bathing. The dispatcher immediately sent officers to the location. When Perris Police Department officers arrived at the single-story ranch home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, nothing seemed out of place from the outside. Neat lawn, American flag, a few decorative items in the windows. But the moment they knocked on the door and David Turpin answered, they knew something was catastrophically wrong. The smell hit them first. A mixture of human waste, rotting food, and unwashed bodies so overpowering that officers had to step back. David Turpin, calm and eerily polite, let them inside without resistance. What they found in the next few minutes would haunt them for the rest of their careers. 13 children, ranging in age from 2 to 29 years old, were living in conditions that defied comprehension. Several were shackled to beds with chains and padlocks. The children, in their 20s, looked like they were 12. One adult daughter weighed just 82 pounds. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, from years without sunlight. Some couldn't speak. Others cowered in corners, terrified of the strangers in uniforms. The house itself was a nightmare. Feces smeared on walls, trash piled in corners. The children slept on filthy mattresses on the floor, some still chained even as police walked through. In the kitchen, officers found food, pies, bread, packaged snacks. But it was clear the children weren't allowed to eat it. This was the parents' food. The children's meals consisted of rotting scraps and occasional peanut butter sandwiches. But what police found in the master bedroom made even seasoned investigators break down. I'll show you in a moment. So who were the people responsible for this horror? David and Louise Turpin met in their early 20s and married in 1985. To the outside world, they seemed like a deeply religious, if somewhat eccentric, couple. David worked as a computer engineer for Northrop Grumman, earning a decent salary. Louise was a stay-at-home mother who homeschooled all 13 of their children, a decision that would later prove catastrophic, as it kept the children completely hidden from mandatory reporters like teachers and school counselors. Neighbors in Perris described the Turpins as quirky but harmless. They'd occasionally see the family outside, always dressed in matching outfits, the children walking in a single-file line. Some neighbors thought it was strange that the kids were so pale and thin, but they assumed it was just genetics or a strict diet. One neighbor recalled seeing the children building a nativity scene in the front yard one Christmas. They worked in complete silence, never smiling, never playing. The Turpins were obsessed with appearances. They renewed their wedding vows in Las Vegas not once, not twice, but 3 times, in 2011, 2013, and 2015. Each ceremony was an elaborate affair, with all 13 children in attendance, dressed in matching purple gowns and tuxedos. Photos from these events show the family smiling, looking like any other large, happy family. But there's one photo that fooled everyone, and it's the reason so many people missed the warning signs for so long. In 2011, the entire Turpin family visited Disneyland. There's a photo of all 15 of them standing in front of Sleeping Beauty's castle, wearing matching denim outfits and Mickey Mouse ears. The children are smiling. They look thin, yes, but not alarmingly so in a single photograph. David and Louise are beaming, arms around their kids. To anyone scrolling past that photo, they looked like a wholesome, if unusually large American family enjoying a day at the happiest place on earth. That photo was shared on social media. It was seen by extended family members, by acquaintances, by strangers, and everyone thought the same thing. What a beautiful family. No one knew that behind closed doors, those same children were being starved, beaten, and chained to their beds. So when did it start? According to investigators and interviews with the adult children, the abuse began gradually in the early 2000s, after the family moved from Texas to California. At first, it was strict rules: no talking back, no playing loudly, no wasting food. But over the years, David and Louise's control became more extreme. Punishments became more severe. Isolation became total. And by the time Jordan climbed out of that window in 2018, some of her siblings had been living in literal chains for years. The Turpins had created a house of horrors hiding in plain sight. And the question everyone was asking was, how did no one notice? To understand how this went undetected for so long, you need to hear what life was actually like inside that house. And I'm warning you, this next part is difficult to hear. What police found in the master bedroom were journals, dozens of them. The Turpin children had been writing about their daily lives for years, documenting their own abuse in careful, childlike handwriting. But here's the twisted part. David and Louise read every single entry. They knew exactly what they were doing to their children. They just didn't care. Let me walk you through what a typical day looked like inside 160 Muirwoods Road. The children were allowed to shower once per year. Once. Some of the adult children told investigators they couldn't remember the last time they'd felt clean. Their hair was matted into thick clumps. Their skin had layers of dirt that had built up over months. The smell was so overpowering that when police removed the children from the home, hospital staff had to prepare special protocols just to treat them. Food was used as a weapon. The children were fed 1 meal per day, if they were lucky. Sometimes it was a single peanut butter sandwich. Sometimes it was a handful of crackers. Jordan later testified that there were months where peanut butter sandwiches were the only thing they ate, meal after meal after meal, until the sight of peanut butter made them physically sick. The portions were so small that the children's bodies began to shut down. Their growth was stunted. Their teeth rotted from malnutrition. None of them had ever seen a dentist. Some of the adult children had never seen a doctor in their entire lives. Punishments were brutal and arbitrary. If a child was caught stealing food, which meant eating anything without permission, they were chained to their beds. Not for hours, not for days, for months at a time. Police found evidence that some children had been shackled so long that the chains had rubbed their skin raw, leaving permanent scars. They were allowed to use the bathroom once a day. The rest of the time, they had no choice but to soil themselves. But perhaps the most disorienting aspect of life in the Turpin house was the schedule. David and Louise kept the children on a nocturnal routine, awake all night, asleep during the day. Why? Because it kept them hidden. Neighbors wouldn't see them during daylight hours. No one would notice that children who should have been at school were locked inside. It was another layer of invisibility. And the homeschooling? It was a complete facade. The children were barely taught to read. Some of the adult children couldn't write their own names. They had no concept of math beyond basic counting. They didn't know what year it was. They'd never heard of most U.S. presidents. Their entire education consisted of occasional Bible readings and copying passages over and over in their journals, the same journals their parents would later read to monitor them. This wasn't a home. It was a prison, and the warden was watching every move. But physical abuse was only half of the horror. David and Louise Turpin's real weapon was psychological control. The rules inside the house were absolute. No talking unless spoken to. No playing. No laughing. No going outside. Ever. The children spent their entire lives within the walls of that house, staring out windows at a world they weren't allowed to be part of. Some of the younger children didn't even know that other people existed beyond their family. One of the cruelest tactics? David and Louise would sit at the kitchen table and eat full meals, pies, cakes, burgers, pizzas, while their starving children watched. They didn't hide the food, they flaunted it. They'd take slow, deliberate bites while making eye contact with their kids, as if daring them to ask for a piece. It was psychological torture designed to break their spirits completely. The house was filled with toys, shelves and shelves of them. Stuffed animals, board games, dolls, action figures, all still in their original packaging. Never opened, never played with. They were decorations, nothing more. A sick joke. The children could see the toys every single day but weren't allowed to touch them. Louise would dust them carefully, maintaining the illusion of a normal childhood home, while the children sat chained to beds in the next room. And those journals I mentioned earlier? David and Louise forced the children to write in them regularly. The parents would read every entry, looking for signs of disobedience or bad thoughts. If a child wrote something that displeased them, punishments would follow. So the children learned to self-censor, to write only what their parents wanted to read. Even their private thoughts weren't safe. Now here's the question everyone asks. Why didn't the older siblings escape? Some of them were in their 20s. They were adults. They could have walked out the door. But it's not that simple. First, there's Stockholm Syndrome. After decades of abuse, many of the adult children had been conditioned to believe their parents' version of reality, that the outside world was dangerous, that they were being protected, that this was normal. They had no frame of reference for what a healthy family looked like. Second, severe malnutrition had caused cognitive impairments. Their brains hadn't developed properly. Decision-making, problem-solving, even basic reasoning skills were compromised. They weren't capable of planning an escape the way a typical adult would be. And third, they were terrified. They'd spent their entire lives being told that if they ever left, something terrible would happen. They'd be hurt. They'd be killed. Their siblings would be punished. The fear was so deeply embedded that even the thought of escape felt impossible. But Jordan was different. Somehow, despite everything, she held on to hope. And she started planning. Jordan's escape plan took 2 years to execute. Here's why it almost failed. Jordan knew she'd only get one chance. If her parents caught her, the punishment would be unimaginable. So she waited. She watched. She prepared. And on that January morning in 2018, she finally made her move. What you've just heard is difficult to process. 13 children living in conditions most of us can't imagine. But this story doesn't end in that house of horrors. If you believe investigations like this matter, if you think these warning signs need to be recognized, please subscribe and share this video. The more people who see cases like the Turpins, the more awareness we build around child abuse that's hiding in plain sight. Drop a comment if this case has impacted you. Now, let's talk about how Jordan Turpin finally escaped. Within hours of Jordan's 911 call, all 13 Turpin children were removed from 160 Muir Woods Road. Ambulances lined the quiet suburban street. Neighbors came out of their homes, shocked, watching as child after child, some carried on stretchers, some walking with assistance, were loaded into emergency vehicles. Many of the neighbors had lived next door to the Turpins for years. They had no idea. David and Louise Turpin were arrested without incident. No resistance. No drama. They were calm, almost confused, as if they genuinely didn't understand what they'd done wrong. Officers reported that both parents seemed more concerned about the disruption to their routine than the fact that their children were being taken away. Perris Police Chief Greg Fellows held a press conference the next day. His voice cracked as he spoke to reporters. "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen anything like this." The 13 siblings were separated and taken to different hospitals across Riverside County. The younger children went to pediatric units. The adult children, some in their 20s but with the physical development of pre-teens, were admitted to specialized care facilities. Doctors had to create individualized treatment plans for malnutrition, dehydration, cognitive delays, and psychological trauma. Some of the children had never been touched gently by another human being. They flinched when nurses tried to help them. And then the media frenzy began. The story exploded across every news outlet in the country. The Disneyland photo went viral. People couldn't comprehend how this had happened in plain sight. The house was in a normal neighborhood. The parents seemed normal. How did no one know? But here's what made the story even more disturbing. The parents' reaction to their arrest. Absolutely chilling. Watch this. In their police interviews, David and Louise showed no remorse. None. They spoke about their children like they were discussing houseplants. When asked why the children were chained to beds, Louise calmly explained it was for their own safety. When asked why they were starved, David said they were on a diet. They genuinely believed they had done nothing wrong. In their minds, they were strict parents, disciplinarians, not torturers. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office filed charges in February 2018. David and Louise Turpin each faced 12 counts of torture, 7 counts of abuse of a dependent adult, 6 counts of child abuse, and multiple counts of false imprisonment. If convicted on all charges, they were looking at life in prison plus 294 years. But there would be no trial. In February 2019, exactly 1 year after their arrest, both David and Louise Turpin pled guilty to all charges. They avoided a trial, which meant the children wouldn't have to testify in open court and relive their trauma in front of cameras. It was a small mercy in an otherwise merciless case. The sentencing hearing was held on April 19, 2019. Several of the adult Turpin children attended. For the first time, they would speak publicly about what their parents had done to them. One sister, her voice shaking but steady, read a victim impact statement. "My parents took my whole life from me, but now I'm taking my life back." Another sibling said, "I love my parents, and that's why this is so hard, but I'm happy they're going to jail." The statements were heartbreaking, a mix of anger, grief, confusion, and even residual love for the people who had tortured them. These children had been so conditioned to believe their parents' version of reality that even in court, even after everything, some of them struggled to fully condemn David and Louise. Judge Bernard Schwartz showed no such conflict. Before handing down the sentence, he looked directly at the Turpins and said, "You have no insight into what you've done. You've destroyed lives. You've destroyed childhoods, and you will spend the rest of your lives paying for it." David and Louise Turpin were each sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. They're currently incarcerated in separate California state prisons. The earliest they'll be eligible for parole is 2044. David will be 73 years old. Louise will be 76. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs as the judge read the sentence. The Turpin children, now free, now safe, held each other. It was over. Or so everyone thought. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn. Because rescuing the Turpin children was only the beginning. What happened to them after they left that house, after they were placed in the care of the state, is almost as horrifying as the abuse itself. When the Turpin children were rescued in January 2018, the public assumed they'd finally be safe. They'd been removed from a house of horrors. They were under the protection of the state. Surely, after everything they'd endured, the system would take care of them. But that's not what happened. The 13 siblings were placed into California's foster care system. Some were kept together. Others were separated. And almost immediately, reports began to surface that the abuse hadn't ended. It had just changed forms. Multiple Turpin children reported being mistreated in their foster placements. Some said they were verbally abused. Others described neglect, being left alone for days, not given adequate food, denied basic necessities. One foster parent was later investigated for misconduct. The children who had finally escaped one nightmare found themselves trapped in another. But the betrayal went even deeper than that. In the months following the rescue, donations poured in from around the world. People were heartbroken by the Turpin story and wanted to help. A fund was set up to support the children's recovery, money for therapy, education, housing, medical care. By the end of 2018, over $600,000 had been donated specifically for the Turpin siblings. The children never received it. Corona Regional Medical Center, which had been tasked with managing the funds, was accused of mishandling the donations. There were allegations of administrative fees, bureaucratic red tape, and funds being diverted to other purposes. The Turpin children, who desperately needed financial support to rebuild their lives, were left with almost nothing. The scandal made national headlines, but by then, the damage was done. The adult siblings, now in their 20s and 30s, were released from the foster care system and expected to survive on their own. But how? They'd never been taught basic life skills. They didn't know how to open a bank account, apply for a job, or navigate public transportation. They had no credit history, no work experience, no support network. They were functionally children in adult bodies, thrown into a world they didn't understand. Some ended up homeless. Some went hungry. Some were taken advantage of by people who saw their vulnerability and exploited it. Jordan Turpin, the girl who had risked everything to save her siblings, watched in horror as the system failed them all over again. In November 2021, Jordan Turpin sat down for an exclusive interview with ABC's 2020. It was the first time she'd spoken publicly about her experience. She was 21 years old, soft-spoken but determined, and what she revealed shocked the nation. "I thought I was going to die many times," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "When I was chained to the bed, when I was starving, when I was planning my escape, I really thought I might not make it." But then she said something even more devastating. Foster care was almost worse than the house. Let that sink in. A young woman who had been tortured, starved, and chained by her own parents said that the system designed to protect her was almost worse. Jordan described being placed in foster homes where she felt unsafe. She talked about being separated from her siblings, the only people in the world who truly understood what she'd been through. She spoke about the loneliness, the confusion, the feeling of being abandoned all over again. After aging out of foster care, Jordan became homeless. She lived in her car. She went days without eating. She couldn't afford basic necessities. The girl who had saved 12 lives couldn't even save her own. I had to ask myself, she said in the interview. Why did I even escape? What was the point if this was going to be my life? But Jordan didn't give up. She went public with her story for one reason: to expose the system's failures and demand accountability. The system failed us twice, she said, looking directly into the camera. My parents failed us, and then the people who were supposed to protect us failed us. I'm speaking out because I don't want this to happen to anyone else. Jordan's message to other survivors was simple but powerful. You are not alone. Your voice matters, and no matter how dark it gets, there is hope. Jordan Turpin. I saved my siblings from my parents, but I couldn't save them from the system. Today, Jordan is an advocate for foster care reform. She's working to finish her education. She's rebuilding her life, one day at a time. And she's using her voice to fight for the siblings she loves and the countless other children trapped in broken systems. Her story isn't just about survival. It's about resilience. It's about refusing to be silenced. And it's a reminder that rescue is only the first step. Real recovery requires a system that actually cares. So what can we learn from the Turpin case? And how do we make sure this never happens again? Let's talk about the warning signs that were missed, and what you can do if you suspect a child is being abused. So where are the Turpin siblings now? 6 years after their rescue, the answer is complicated. Some of them are thriving. Several of the younger siblings have graduated high school, something they never thought would be possible. A few have enrolled in community college, pursuing degrees in fields like social work and psychology. They want to help other survivors. They want to turn their pain into purpose. Some have found jobs. They're learning to drive. They're making friends. They're experiencing things most people take for granted: going to a movie theater, eating at a restaurant, choosing their own clothes. One sibling described the first time she went to a grocery store and could pick out whatever food she wanted. I just stood there and cried. I couldn't believe I was allowed to choose. But not all of the siblings are doing well. Some are still struggling with severe PTSD. They have nightmares. They have panic attacks. They can't be in enclosed spaces without feeling like they're back in that house, chained to a bed. The trauma doesn't just disappear because the abuser is in prison. Others are dealing with cognitive delays that may never fully resolve. Years of malnutrition during critical developmental periods caused permanent brain damage. Some siblings will need support for the rest of their lives, help with basic tasks, supervised living situations, ongoing medical care. And then there's the issue of trust. After being betrayed by their parents and then failed by the foster care system, many of the Turpin siblings struggle to trust anyone. Forming healthy relationships is incredibly difficult when your entire childhood taught you that the people who are supposed to love you will hurt you instead. Jordan continues her advocacy work. She's spoken at conferences. She's met with lawmakers. She's pushing for foster care reform and better protections for abuse survivors. She's determined to make sure her siblings' suffering wasn't for nothing. The bond between the siblings is complicated. Some remain extremely close. They're the only people who truly understand what they went through. They text daily. They visit each other. They celebrate birthdays and holidays together, creating the family traditions they never had as children. But others have become estranged. The trauma affected each of them differently. Some want to move forward and never look back. Others are still processing what happened and need space. A few have cut off contact entirely, finding it too painful to be reminded of their shared past. All of them are in ongoing therapy. Some days are better than others. Recovery isn't linear. It's messy and painful and slow. But they're surviving. And for children who were never supposed to make it out of that house alive, survival is a victory. But the Turpin case raises questions that go far beyond one family. How did this happen? And more importantly, how do we make sure it never happens again? Let's start with the most obvious question. Why didn't Child Protective Services investigate earlier? The truth is, there were red flags. Lots of them. Neighbors reported seeing pale, thin children staring out windows at odd hours. A few people called authorities expressing concern. But each time, the reports were either dismissed or inadequately followed up on. CPS made brief visits to the home. David and Louise were polite, cooperative, and convincing. They showed paperwork proving the children were homeschooled. They gave explanations that satisfied the investigators, and the case was closed. This points to a massive loophole in California's homeschooling laws, one that still exists today. Parents can file an affidavit declaring their intent to homeschool, and that's essentially it. There are no mandatory check-ins, no standardized testing, no home visits to verify that education is actually taking place. It's an honor system. And in the Turpin case, that honor system allowed 13 children to be tortured for decades without anyone noticing. Since 2018, there have been some changes. California passed new legislation requiring more oversight of homeschooling situations, particularly in cases where abuse is suspected. Some counties have implemented mandatory wellness checks for homeschooled children. Training for CPS workers has been updated to include warning signs of extreme isolation and neglect. But here's the uncomfortable truth. These reforms are inconsistent. They vary by county. They depend on funding. They rely on overworked social workers who are managing impossible caseloads. The system is better than it was in 2018, but it's far from perfect. Which brings us to the final question. Could this happen again? The answer to that last question will shock you. Yes. Absolutely yes. Right now, as you're watching this video, there are children living in situations similar to the Turpin house. They're isolated. They're homeschooled with no oversight. They're being abused behind closed doors. And no one knows. The Turpin case wasn't an anomaly. It was a failure of systems that are still broken. And until we fundamentally change how we protect vulnerable children, until we close the loopholes, fund the agencies, and empower neighbors to speak up, it will happen again. That's not pessimism, that's reality. And it's why cases like this matter. Why we have to keep talking about them. Why we can't look away. The Turpin children survived the unthinkable, but their story isn't over. And neither is the fight to protect children like them. Jordan Turpin risked everything to save her siblings. She climbed out of that window not knowing if she'd be caught, not knowing if anyone would believe her, not knowing if the outside world would be any safer. And in many ways it wasn't. But she survived. They all survived. And their story reminds us that rescue is just the first step. Real justice means ensuring survivors have the support they need to rebuild their lives. If this case opened your eyes to the failures in our child welfare system, please share this video. Leave a comment telling me what you think needs to change. And let me know, what case should I investigate next? Thank you for watching and for caring about these stories. See you in the next one.